Hay River's most visible landmark is a 17-story high-rise residential tower the developer named Mackenize Place. Locals simply call it the high-rise. Mackenize Place looks like many other North American post-war towers built to deal with urbanization, a concrete rectangle with rows of identical windows and balconies and minimal architectural flourishes. If it were in a city, it would likely not catch your attention.
In the context of the small northern community of Hay River, the high-rise is a visual anomaly.
When driving north by car, you can begin to spot the high-rise from 75 kilometers away. What strikes a first-time visitor as curious is not the building itself, but rather what is not around it. Most modern residential towers are in clusters and face other towers. This one sits on the bank of a river in a small Canadian subarctic town.
With everything else around only 1 or 2 stories high, the building looks like it was left here by accident.
It is wearing out in ways common for towers of its vintage. The butter yellow exterior paint is peeling. The windows need to be upgraded. One of the 2 elevators is often out of service. There is nothing particularly unique about the building structure. The balconies are uncluttered. Through the iron railings, you might see a single plastic chair. For most of the year, it is much too cold to sit outside. Satellite dishes are affixed to the railings along the southwest side, a modern log growing gray plastic mushrooms.
Mackenize Place is home to a diverse set of working-class people from a variety of backgrounds: Indigenous, Dene, Inuvialuit, Cree, Métis, settler and immigrant. Mackenize Place was built in the 1960s on the promise of the proposed Mackenzie Valley Pipeline that never came to pass. Since then, it has been repurposed to house those making a living, working in extractive industries, and supporting public sectors.
In 2008, I stood in the lobby of the rundown building staring at plastic white letters that listed the names of tenants who were long gone. As I waited to be let in by the building's rental manager, I read and reread the 3 posted rules. No smoking in front, no dogs, no hotel room.
As I waited for the superintendent's wife, I jingled my car keys in my pocket, hopeful that this move would finally set in motion my research on the effects the diamond boom was having on the area. I was in the high-rise that day, trying to find a place to live, to begin to study this transformation from the perspective of those living through it. The cream-colored walls, the peeling linoleum tiles, and the buzzer system that did not work were just as I remembered them. 5 years earlier, I was there under very different circumstances. Then, I was a school teacher who had just arrived to take a job teaching 4th grade in a French language school. I was transferred to this large, by Northern standards, town from a small village in the high Arctic. My partner had been promoted to principal of one of the schools.
On that first visit in 2003, we waited in between these same 2 glass doors for the superintendent, who was going to show us a 2-bedroom apartment to rent. Trying to imagine a long, cold, dark winter in the decaying building, I became impatient.
Let's just leave. There's no way that I'm going to live here.
The day of my arrival as a researcher, Cindy, the building owner's girlfriend and the property manager, saw me and let me in.
Holy, you got a lot of stuff. Let me get my son Trevor to help you. Trevor, come help this university woman with her stuff.
I tried to assure her that I could manage, but she insisted.
It's fine. He's not doing anything anyhow. He is going back to school soon, though. He has a real good opportunity coming up. He's going to be taking an underground mining class at the college here. There's a lot of good jobs up at those diamond mines, you know?
When Cindy told me about her son's upcoming course in underground diamond mining, I was reassured that my move into the high-rise had not been in vain. I was hoping to meet people trying to make a future through resource work, and here was my first possible participant. I was familiar with the course Cindy was referring to, It was the most recent iteration of educational opportunities that were supposed to move local people into high-wage work in mining.
When there is a rise in northern economic activity, many people move to the region from other parts of Canada, and increasingly from around the world. This includes Indigenous people like Cindy and Trevor, who are Cree but not locals. In-migrants usually end up in the small number of peri-urban hubs like Hay River, as they are accessible by road and have more, even if slim, choices for rental housing.
Trevor appeared, dragging a large, stubborn-wheeled metal cart to the front door. He had on baggy jeans and a backwards red New York Yankees hat. On the side of his neck was a small tattoo whose green ink had weathered in a way that made the symbol undecipherable. He silently piled my stuff on the wire bed of the cart and asked,
8th floor, right?
In the elevator, my questions about his upcoming mining course are met with one-word answers. I asked him if he is from town.
Me? Am I really from this shithole? No way. I'm from Larange, Saskatchewan. Some other shithole.
Trevor's home community was a former logging town that had seen the end of the industry. His father moved them to Hay River to work in mine construction. After their divorce, Trevor's father moved to another resource boom region, while Cindy elected to stay behind with her 2 sons to try and make a living here.
For many people I spoke to, chasing the good life in Hay River and other resource towns often involves imagining leaving them.
The high-rise was a strategic housing choice to get me closer to the people most closely involved in the processes of extraction. Over time, I came to realize that the building did more than merely house the people who could tell the story of the northern resource economy. Instead, the building itself is a critical storied element of how extraction comes to make sense for many people.
I was not alone in my initial murky understanding of high-rise residence. My now ex-partner had never been in the high-rise after that first visit to the lobby in 2003, despite having now been in the community for 10 years. After visiting me a few times, she declared,
"There are people here I have never seen before in my life. This place is a separate culture."
Yet, high-rise culture has never made it onto an ethno-cultural map of the Northwest Territories. Unlike so-called local traditional cultures, it is not written up as a tourist attraction or described as a source of pride. No one, not even its tenants, would tell you that the high-rise is the real Hay River. With only a few exceptions, most tenants spend their time distancing themselves from high-rise culture rather than embracing it.
Billy showed up for his interview with 6 cans of Molson Canadian beer, a bottle of white wine, and a small bottle of root beer schnapps. He was one of the 7 men who immediately responded to the participant recruitment flyers I slipped under the high-rise's 85 apartment doors. I often saw Billy at the local pub when he was on his out rotation from one of the diamond mines. He worked in logistics, which I understood to roughly translate to putting things and people in the right places around the worksite and camp. In the interview, his speech style wavered from wildly excited to quiet and conspiratorial. It was clear that he felt vulnerable about leaking any information about the mines that could get him into trouble.
They really keep tabs on you, you know?
Billy was over 50 years old when he was let go from his job at a meatpacking plant in Toronto. When he heard the news about diamonds in the Northwest Territories in the mid-1990s, he knew where to go to find better work. When he arrived in Hay River, he spent his first years in the shipping industry. Billy worked the boats for his first summer and then actively pursued a job with the mines as a more permanent employment option.
Billy got a job with a local automotive company that held multiple contracts with the mines. Part of his company's winning bid proposal is their claim to a 100% northern employee rate. Since Billy had an address and had been in the territories for 3 months, he was considered a northerner and eligible to be hired. He spoke with slight frustration about the policy. On the one hand, it had given him a leg up to get into the mines, but now he felt like he was stuck in Hay River. He had wanted to move back to Newfoundland and fly back and forth like many of the other subcontractors, but giving up his address would mean giving up his job, as the 100% Northern employee policy was strictly enforced, at least at his level.
Billy had been saving for quite some time, and he bought his first home, a small trailer, the winter after we initially spoke. I would pass him on the street occasionally, and at one point he let me know that his job position was more vulnerable than he had initially communicated. Additionally, owning a home made him more concerned about keeping a steady job. In late May 2009, he told me that the workforce at the mine had been cut in half. His job was considered part of the site's maintenance, so regardless of whether it was in production or not, he was still needed. Still, he was concerned because the mines were increasingly ending subcontracts. He had heard of some workers being let go by the subcontractor and then wooed back by the mine directly. These were not circumstances he could count on. He was doing his best to do what he called a top performance on each and every shift.
Gary arrived from the maritime province of New Brunswick in 2008. Gary's booming voice and assertive stance stood in stark contrast to the Seven Dwarfs sweatshirt he wore to my apartment on a Sunday afternoon in August. He sat in a wing chair with his feet thrown over the right arm. He was in town on a contract to install sprinklers in a newly built assisted living facility.
2 years earlier, Gary was living in his car in Woodstock, New Brunswick, when a contractor picked him up to work as labor on a job at the local hospital. A few days into the job, the boss realized that Gary would have to be registered as an apprentice. The hospital was a government project, and in New Brunswick, all provincial projects require laborers be enrolled as apprentices to accumulate hours toward professional certification. When the job ended, Gary had worked enough hours to write his first block of apprentice tests. He was delighted when he passed, but his excitement quickly dissipated as the employer would not take him back due to the legislated wage increase that came with training.
While on the job site, Gary worked with someone who did contract work in the Northwest Territories. Gary's new contact had passed along information for a company that did similar work to Gary's new trade, sprinkler installation. With his unemployment payments dwindling, Gary sent a resume to Yellowknife. That same day, he got a call from the employer with an offer to fly him up the following day. He explained it this way.
Well, I'm single, right? And I don't care. And I'm tired of not paying my payments. I'm tired of Honda Canada calling me everything but a delinquent, right? I'm tired of having surcharges at the Royal Bank. I said yes. I had no idea. I'm not world traveled. I'm 51 years old, and I had never been on an airplane in my life. Well, the next day, I took 3.
His first project was putting in a sprinkler system at a power plant in a diamond mine. Largely, he enjoyed the work.
It's awesome. The food is next to none.
He did note that there were a few downsides.
In a way, it's a glorified jail. The only difference is if you screw up, you get kicked out. But I had a good experience.
When his first 3 weeks were complete, he was flown home, where he collected unemployment insurance until he got another call from Yellowknife. Now, on a second contract in Hay River, Gary was enjoying the high salary he is earning.
Well, that is what I'm here for, the money, not anything else. I get awesome pay, $18 an hour. Plus, for every hour I work safely, I get $1 put in a kitty for me. I can cash it in anytime I want to buy tools. I get a food allowance of $55 a day. I work 2 hours of overtime every day, and I work every Saturday. It works for me because I have nobody to care for but myself, and I can go anywhere on a minute's notice.
Gary's employer was paying for his high-rise apartment. His wage, without overtime, was actually on the lower end for the North, but compared to New Brunswick, it was extremely high. Because Gary did not have to pay to subsist in the North, he found his temporary stay quite comfortable, yet his participation in the Northern economy puts downward pressure on wages. At the job's end, he had accumulated 1,200 hours of work. He was able to go back on unemployment and prepare to write the second block of apprenticing exams.
I was certain that I had overestimated the move into the building as the perfect jumpstart to fieldwork. I lay awake lost in plans to improve as an ethnographer the next day when the distinctive thumping sound of hip-hop music started coming from the apartment next to mine. When I listened closely, I recognized the unmistakable sound of Flo Rida's club anthem from the early 2000s, Low. It was 3 a.m, and the track was on repeat. I assumed the apartment next to mine was occupied by men who worked rotations in the diamond mines. Mine work typically consists of 2 weeks of 12-hour shifts in the mines, followed by 2 weeks out.
The next morning, to my surprise, I saw a young woman come out onto the balcony next to mine. Her metal-framed balcony door squeaked loudly, as did mine. Over time, this sound became the signal to the other that we wanted to talk.
Even with the crisp October air, Destiny wore a slinky, lacy-strapped tank top and a zip-up hoodie left undone. She had on dark sunglasses, the kind Audrey Hepburn might wear. Leaning on the iron railings and talking every evening until the snow made it impossible, I came to learn that Destiny was a 22-year-old Dene woman, a hip-hop aficionado, an herbal tea lover, and an absolute perfectionist when it came to her appearance. She combined intricately braided hair with dark and glamorous eye makeup. She was a member of the Katlodeche First Nation Reservation across the river from the town of Hay River. Destiny hadn't traveled far to move into the high-rise apartment next to mine, yet she spoke like she was worlds away from her life on the reserve.
I'm never going back. Why would I want to be stuck over there?
Even though the town and the First Nation are separated by a relatively narrow stretch of river, travel between the two isn't always straightforward. In winter, a plowed ice road lets vehicles go across from reserve to town in under 5 minutes. The all-season bridge is at the town's southern boundary. In warmer weather, it takes about 25 minutes by car to make the 14-kilometer trip around and across, bumping along a dirt road. Taxi fare is $50 each way. In town, the First Nation is simply called the Reserve, and on the Reserve, town is simply referred to as a cross. Without vehicle access or sufficient resources, being stuck on the Reserve can be taken literally.
This apartment because I'm going back to school. I was just sick of all the partying and shit at my mom's. I just had it. With going to school, I get my own place. I am going to take real good care of it, like keep it real clean and stuff.
Determined to be an ideal tenant, Destiny would do a killer clean every Saturday before attending to her social plans for the evening. Her apartment consistently smelled of bleach and hairspray. She decorated the walls with carefully lined photographs of family, friends, and eventually an anthropologist. She hung a poster of Tupac Shakur next to the Dene Nation flag. What are you taking at school?
Like mining or something like that?
Destiny enrolled in a training program for higher-paid underground diamond mine work. She jumped on the offer when someone pointed it out to her. She let me know that it would be real good money.
In this small community of 4,000 people, the high-rise looks desperately out of place. It is rare to see a tower of this scale not beside others. Unlike most high-rise towers, which face other towers, this one casts its midnight summer shadow on what feels like an endless stretch of taiga.
High-rise residential towers like this one were increasingly common in the post-war northeastern United States after World War II. Inspired by Swiss-French architect Le Corbusier's radiant city concepts from the 1930s, tall, high-density housing was a hallmark of Western architecture modernity in big cities. The new building would be able to house well over 300 people and offered amenities like a coin laundromat and convenience store accessible from within the building. The original drawings included a second-story, above-ground tunnel to the businesses across the street. This type of modern architectural feature became a staple in cold Canadian cities trying to solve the issue of confronting winter weather.
The presence of a lone high-rise tower on a subarctic landscape is striking and impossible for any visitor to ignore.
To understand why and how a tall, modern tower came to be built in a small subarctic town, it is important to understand some broad outlines of the history and geography of the area. The high-rise overlooks the town's namesake, the Hay River. The Hay River travels north from Alberta and connects to Great Slave Lake, one of the world's largest freshwater lakes. The mouth of the river provides for excellent fishing. As such, it was used seasonally by the Dene peoples for thousands of years. Dene people fish and hunt and thus chose different sites in the region to make their livelihoods. Existing seasonal sites became more permanent dwellings for some Dene when the presence of the fur trade posts and missionaries began to take root in the 1860s.
At the turn of the 20th century, settlements along the lakefront on both sides of the river began to take shape.
The high-rise was in the planned center of Hay River's new town, on the West Bank. A Toronto-based developer bought the key downtown lots and based the high-rise plans on British-imported designs increasingly common in Toronto in the 1960s. With the new pipeline project rumored to be in the works, the building was imagined to accommodate the eventual influx of migrants. It was meant to showcase the North as a place with potential to be modern, a place where non-Indigenous people could live with city comforts.
Unlike other modernization schemes across the Arctic and subarctic, which were aimed at the indigenous population, the high-rise was aimed at attracting a working middle class that was not yet necessarily in town.
The so-called modern features of the town's development, like a recreation center and multiple grocery stores, were, and are to this day, essential to drawing labor north on the promise that one can lead a good life, by Southern standards, north of the 60th parallel.
The high-rise was officially named Alexander Mackenzie Place, after the Scottish explorer credited with mapping many northern regions and waterways. Like many things in settler colonial Canada, these naming practices are integral in erasing Indigenous presence.
The high-rise, as an icon of modernity, helped to create an image of northern Canada as available for investment and development.
Ivan moved to Hay River from Chile in 1978. His apartment had the identical layout as mine, yet it felt unfamiliar. The walls were filled with neatly framed family photographs and posters of airplanes. Ivan's 11-year-old son stood hiding behind the front door as I arrived and quickly took off to a friend's apartment. Ivan sat down, crossed his legs, and began to tell me about his 30 years in the Northwest Territories.
Being an immigrant and coming up here is like winning the lottery. When we arrived, they were desperate for help. Dad took a job as a janitor for $1,000 a week and could not believe it. Although my father had been wealthy in Chile and had owned his own business, he did not mind being the janitor because he was still treated like a mister. We became servants, but we were well treated, so that was confusing to us.
In 1979, the nearby Pine Point lead and zinc mine just east of Hay River was in full swing. Ivan got a job as a mill operator for $12.20 an hour. While employed, the company paid for his room and board. He stayed for 3.5 years. He told me about the strength of his union at that time, the United Steelworkers. They taught him about coffee breaks and got him an English tutor. These are 2 lessons he said he was still grateful for.
I was mostly working with native guys, some from Manitoba, some from Fort Resolution. That's how I know so many elders from there. Those guys were all at Pine Point working the day shifts at the sawmill.
During a recession, the mine took a 6-week closure. Ivan had wanted to move up to surface work and took the closure as an opportunity to move on. When the mine reopened, he was reoffered his position, but he turned it down in favor of pursuing his diploma for motor vehicle licensing and instruction. Ivan rattled off a long list of the career changes that took him all over the territories. He had tried owning a restaurant in Yellowknife with his wife, but ended up back in Hay River when it did not get off the ground.
We were happy to come back to Hay River. It's friendly here. At first, I thought it was creepy, weird, but now I think it's special.
Ivan was now a truck driver for one of the largest ground shipping companies in the region. He had been with the company long enough to primarily go on short-haul day trips. His load was usually groceries and mailed, destined for different communities on the same side of the lake as Hay River. Ivan's marriage was in trouble, and that was what landed him in the high-rise. He had faith that God would bring him and his wife back together again. Since Ivan's arrival in the late 1970s, the number of immigrants to the Northwest Territories has tripled, making northern locals more multicultural than ever before.
Michelle had moved to Hay River in the high-rise from a nearby indigenous community. Michelle was 30 years old and 2 semesters from completing her high school diploma.
I am sick of planning for my future.
Michelle was one of 8 young mothers who lived in the high-rise. I met her at the Hay River Community College. Before teaching the work readiness course, I was invited to talk to the college students, all women, about being a woman in university. It was supposed to be motivational. Tim, the college director, felt that many of the women were very close to moving on, but that for some reason, they continued to drag their feet close to graduation or in the application stage for university. My job was to help them make a 5-year plan. During my best effort to provide a non-condescending and informative talk, most of the women looked completely unimpressed. In a one-on-one conversation later, Michelle explained her feelings on the matter.
I mean, you spend all this time planning out what to do, and you think, okay, this is going to work. Then, of course, something happens, and you are right back where you started. It's a waste of time, all these plans.
Michelle had 2 children who were in primary school. After talking for some time, she let me know that she was expecting again, and that was why she was so resistant to committing to more courses. She explained,
My boyfriend is looking for full-time work now, and that means in the mines. He will have to do 2 weeks in and 2 weeks out. I can't go to school and raise 3 kids when I have to be alone half the time.
I asked her about other employment possibilities for her and her boyfriend, but she was adamant.
The mines pay really well. We will be able to get ahead.
Michelle did not return to the college for her final semester of her GED. In the new year, she and her family left the high-rise and moved in with her parents. Her boyfriend had not had much luck getting a job in the mines, so they needed to cut expenses before the baby arrived.
The high-rise was at its inception an instance of infrastructural prospecting, meaning that in anticipation of the arrival of megaprojects, local and non-local investors stake claims on the kinds of supporting infrastructure those megaprojects may need.
The importance of infrastructural prospecting struck me as I interviewed Albert, the first manager of the high-rise. In the 1970s, he left his position as the town's school bus driver to take the new job. He recalled the early years of the high-rise in a tone that tacked back and forth between enthusiasm and remorse. Now in his 70s, with leather tattoos and living in a small, modular home, Albert told me about the eagerness of local business owners to see the high-rise happen.
It was all about the town's big wheels. You know what I mean? The big wheels wanted it, and they got it.
As Albert's comments about the big wheels reveal, the high-rise stood for a future very few local people wanted. The local newspaper referred to it as a human filing cabinet, while the building owners advertised it as offering modern, cosmopolitan living on par with cities like Calgary. Local people saw it as an imposition that represented all that is wrong with urban life.
For its supporters in the 1970s, the high-rise was a clear sign that the North was ready for development and modernization. However, during construction of the high-rise, plans for the pipeline were shelved as a result of Indigenous activism, a growing Canadian environmental movement, and the falling price of oil.
Holding a coffee mug that said "Believe" in cursive lettering, Albert described the high-rise as a white elephant. In North America, white elephant is often a term used to refer to an expensive burden that fails to meet expectations. The construction of the high-rise was a feat in its own right. The company that built Toronto's CN Tower was brought in to erect the structure. Building materials had to be shipped in by rail, a process that was stalled when rail workers went on strike before all of the materials had arrived.
The cost to build the high-rise was far more than anticipated. Occupancy once it was completed was much lower than expected, creating almost immediate financial problems. Albert described having to take materials like toilets from empty apartments on lower floors to replace broken items in the occupied units.
There was no money left for upkeep, so I had to make do with what was around.
The high-rise was meant to house new middle-class professionals, which has not been its fate. In the high-rise, top units are renovated and have better views. These units are generally occupied by white public servants. Indigenous and immigrant renters tend to be clustered in poorly maintained units near the bottom. I was told explicitly by many people in town that I should try and get a unit on a higher floor to avoid the worst of it.
Even if the building was and remains a financial disappointment, it has been sold 5 times since construction and has gone into receivership more than once. It is part of the architecture of extraction in that it houses a just-in-time labor supply for resource booms and busts. Two structures mark the center of the subarctic transportation town of Hay River. The first is an 8-foot Inukshuk. The second is the tallest residential building in the territory, the Mackenzie Place high-rise.
Across the street from the high-rise, the Inukshuk stands on the lawn of the fire station and town hall. Inuksuit are stone cairns once used as navigational markers on Arctic landscapes that otherwise held few distinctive features. While Inuksuit are typically built from found stones, this one is an imitation made of a tan resin and is hollow inside. Inuksuit often symbolize permanent connection to place, landscape intimacy, and reference Canada's northernmost ethnocultural group, Inuit.
The high-rise and the Inukshuk present themselves as distinct symbols with separate semiotic duties. They each point to configurations of time and space outside of the present.
The Inukshuk points to a distant past, while the high-rise was intended to mark the way to a modern future. Simultaneously, modern in the making and ethnically traditional, Hay River is much like of the Canadian North, is often talked about in terms of these temporal polarities, always reaching out and away to some other time, never fully being a kind of acceptable present. Despite their differences, both structures were erected in the latter half of the 1970s, on the heels of a pipeline that never came to pass.
Infrastructure from past projects, even failed ones, animates contemporary concerns over extractive futures.
Chris had been in Canada for 7 years and had not once returned home. He emailed me to set up his interview and I could not place his name from his message, although I had been in the building for 6 months by the time I put up recruitment flyers. I had never seen him before the day I showed up at his 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor.
In the spare bedroom, he had set up a recording studio where he sang and recorded Filipino folk songs, as well as original works in what he simply referred to as my language. He would send the CDs he recorded to his wife and children, who still lived in the Philippines.
From our conversation, I learned that Chris had trained as an engineer and worked in the capital city of Manila before graduating. He then went to Saudi Arabia for 5 years to work for a German company. He used his savings to return home in the late 1980s and started a small business, which then failed. He arrived in Canada to work for Mackenize, an automotive systems company. He thought he was going to work in Toronto, but was told by his employer that he was misoriented and would need so-called Canadian experience for those positions. He was given a job in Magna's factory in St. Thomas, Ontario. He held it for 2 years before being laid off.
Chris took a job at a local fast food chain. He described it as being a little embarrassing when he told me that he kept the job in order to support his family. When he saw a 6-month contract with the NWT Power Corporation, he applied for it. He was on his second 6-month contract when he spoke in the high-rise. Although he was extremely proficient in English, Chris seemed certain that without learning to minimize his accent, he would never get a better position. He often asked me for English lessons, as ESL courses were unavailable in town.
Marion pulled up to the high-rise in a Ford Focus station wagon in November. Her possessions filled the back half of the car. In the passenger seat was Sadie, her French bulldog, dressed in a sailor's costume. Marion was one of 4 new tenants in the high-rise who had come to work as nurses or nurses' aides in the new assisted living facility. Marion was close to retirement and felt financially underprepared. She was a registered practical nurse working in Ontario and had come up north in the early 1990s to earn the higher salaries afforded to northern and rural public servants. She had saved enough to return to Ontario and buy a house. However, over the course of her 4 years in the north, the conditions of work and healthcare provision had changed significantly.
The deterioration of conditions of work in other parts of the country is a large part of why people move north.
Although the Mackenzie Place high-rise sits on a relatively flat stretch of subarctic landscape and can be seen from 70 kilometers away, for many residents, both in the town and in the tower, it is often described as a site better left unseen.
Wearing out in ways common to post-war towers, the slow decay of building materials and of its internal functions have been expedited by 4 months of sub-zero winter temperatures, incessant sun in the summer months, and unpredictable rental income that ebbs and flows with the region's mineral and gas economy.
The exterior paint is dull and chipping. Some balconies are now condemned. Signs warning tenants not to go out on the unstable concrete have been taped to sliding glass doors. For many local people and visitors to the region, a weathered tower on a subarctic landscape fails to meet expectations about either industrial progress or natural purity of the subarctic. The 2008 Lonely Planet travel guide for Canada called Hay River hard bitten, which caused quite a stir locally and was primarily blamed on the unsightly high-rise.
For the northern middle class, the material failures of the building are often blamed on tenants who are presumed to be transient and thus disinterested in the arts of domestic care. My 2 years in the high-rise proved otherwise. Most tenants took great care to have their apartments reflect them. Walls were adorned with neat rows of photographs of friends and family. Surfaces might have had single knick-knack made by a relative or northern craftsperson, a birch bark basket, or a stone carving of a bear.
The upkeep of the units was an opportunity for self-expression, but was equally a way for some tenants to distance themselves from the accusations that all high-rise residents were, as one of my interlocutors put it, riff-raff. Many tenants I interviewed described the building as ghetto and maintained that they would not be living there for long.
An important part of being in the high-rise was expressing that you didn't truly belong there.
Tenants expressed many disappointments with the accommodations in the high-rise. Most glaringly was having to pay a rental price near double the national average for a unit in disrepair. Other disappointments seemed small, but gained weight by their everydayness.
Like trying to get through the narrow entranceway with large bags of groceries and tripping on peeling linoleum tiles. Or having to evacuate when the aging fire alarm goes off. Or having to wait for 10 minutes for an elevator because the other one is out of service. Or having to hear couples fight and trying to decide how serious it is and whether you should react.
While tenants expressed many laments about the physical state of the building and the behavior of their fellow residents, there were intimacies afforded by the thin walls and slow, cramped elevator everyone had to use. One afternoon, when my collaborator and I entered one of the two elevators, and a tenant, a man in his 50s, said,
"I guess this isn't the one?"
His eyes ran over the perimeter of the scratched, shellacked, wood-paneled elevator walls.
Guy said an elevator was covered in blood this morning. Blood everywhere.
The man was in the building while on a short work contract to install stucco ceiling at the new hospital.
For newcomers, these visceral events and possible traces left in the elevator offered an opportunity to engage.
I hear it wasn't no one from the building.
We then noticed 3 thin dark red streaks on the door close to the bottom. For the rest of that day, everyone will use elevator exchanges to try to piece together what could have happened. Those who sit and smoke at the picnic table out front will get pieces of the story from the property managers, who are out watering their struggling plants. One manager repeats the same joke to each passerby.
23 hours of sunshine. You think this shit would grow faster.
His wife hauls a green watering can in and out of their ground floor unit. These events and others that were much more serious, domestic violence ending in death, people falling from balconies, physical fights in the parking lot, drew people's curiosity and criticism. Who or what was responsible for these types of violence? These spectacular events, although less common than people reported, as well as people's mundane everyday difficulties, are what people wanted to talk most about.
It became clear through countless interviews that these concerns were not interpreted as failures of expedited resource development, but of the building itself.
People, for the most part, wanted out, but there was nowhere to go.
It is in the wanting to leave the high-rise that high-wage work in mining comes to make sense. For the underemployed, to secure work in a mine was often a stated goal. For the professional class tenants, their time in the building and in the community was to amass experience that could be used to bolster their chances of finding a job somewhere else and moving on.
Disappointment creates a sense of wanting an otherwise, a collective feeling of not this kind of future, but another one.
More often than not, when I told anyone that I was in town for research and living in the high-rise, I would be told, "That's not the real Hay River." Hay River is sometimes described as not the real North, on account of its physical location as one of the southernmost communities in the NWT and its population being half non-Indigenous.
How can spaces like a transportation community so crucial to national and global economic markets be considered not the real North?
How can a good segment of the working class be considered not the real Hay River?
How can a building that can be seen from anywhere in the community be interpreted as separate from it?
I received a photo of billows of black smoke coming from the high-rise via text in March of 2019. As the day went on, the same photo and the accompanying news story were sent to me multiple times from various friends living in the NWT. The high-rise had a massive fire.
All 150 tenants were evacuated, and temporary shelters were set up in the town's recreation center, in the Friendship Center, and on the Katlodeche First Nation Reserve. The cause of the fire was unknown.
To this day, there is nothing conclusive about how, or perhaps who, started the blaze. The high-rise remains condemned. Residents have not been allowed to move back in. Many found other sources of housing, while some people continue to be without permanent shelter.
The local newspaper estimates that over a dozen people, primarily Indigenous residents, including some elderly people, have yet to find stable housing.
After the fire, the high-rise was purchased by what a local newspaper described as a sophisticated Western Canadian company. The company, Heritage Valley Capital, has a limited web presence. They self-describe as providing double-digit returns for investors looking for passive, secure income through real estate development projects and cash flow products. The purchase of the high-rise is the latest iteration of infrastructural prospecting. Past failures become future extractive opportunities for those who can afford them.
In talking to local media about plans to renovate the high-rise, the investors imagine the desires and aspirations of future tenants who are not yet there. One developer commented,
"There's nothing stopping that building from having a gym, having a theater, having a quartz countertop, and being the same that you would get in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Surrey, or wherever."
The investors told local news that their aim was to help address the region's housing shortage, but just who will be housed in the next iteration of the high-rise is unclear. As of March 2023, no work has been done on the property.